China is pushing a coronavirus scam while the disease spreads in the Middle East and around the world, and how corruption at the WHO has made the coronavirus worse. This is China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. This week's China News headlines. An update on the coronavirus disease, also called COVID-19. It's now spread to at least 48 countries. But the World Health Organization is declining to call it a pandemic. Cool. Just like they declined to call it a global health emergency a month ago. Now, a pandemic means that a disease is spreading around the world. And the WHO used to have specific criteria for declaring a pandemic. And with outbreaks in China, South Korea, Italy, and Iran, COVID-19 would likely have met those criteria. But the good news is, now the WHO's criteria for pandemics is a lot more vague. According to the Director General, the coronavirus is not a pandemic because there hasn't been uncontained global spread or large-scale severe disease or death. Instead, the head of the WHO says these are epidemics in different parts of the world. I mean, South Korea is reporting record daily spikes and Japan is closing all schools. It's spreading throughout the Middle East, with Iran having the highest death toll outside of China, and the guy in charge of fighting it in Iran was infected. Coronavirus cases are also surging in Italy and spreading from Italy to the rest of Europe, and it's in Latin America now. But thank goodness it's not a pandemic yet. However, official numbers of new coronavirus cases are down in China. Unfortunately, that might just be because the Communist Party has a coronavirus scam, changing the definition of what an infection is. They've changed the definition 6 times so far. So what does it mean that the numbers are going down? According to an expert at Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, there are 2 possibilities. The draconian social distancing measures China has taken are really driving the number of cases down, or health officials are changing their view of what constitutes a case. Kind of like how the party lifted millions of people out of poverty by changing the definition of what poverty meant. Most of those people are now called low income. Problem solved. But one thing we can all confidently count on is the lack of medical supplies, since everything is made in China. The coronavirus is hitting the Chinese economy hard. Factories are struggling to start up again after being shut down. Only 1/3 of Chinese small businesses are open. And migrant workers, a critical part of the Chinese economy, can't move throughout the country because of quarantines and border restrictions. You know what that means? Now's the right time to buy Chinese stocks. And JP Morgan says the Chinese economy will grow in the second quarter. I mean, just think about how much money can be made in China. There's probably no downside at all, especially if you don't learn from history.
I wish I knew how to quit you.
Then why don't you?
The Trump administration is considering punishing Chinese state-run news organizations operating in the United States. That's in retaliation for China kicking out 3 Wall Street Journal reporters, which itself was possibly retaliation for the U.S. labeling Chinese state-run media operatives of China's communist state, which they are. Some of them are part of the Chinese Communist Party's Central Propaganda Department. Others are directly under the party's Central Committee. Reporters with state-run media in the U.S. have been accused of essentially spying for the Communist Party. That's why the new punishments the Trump administration are considering may include expelling journalists who have contact with intelligence agencies. Then again, I have to say, my opinion of Chinese state-run media really changed after China Daily called China Uncensored a leading Western media outlet. Also, disgraceful anti-China garbage, which seems to have come out of a gossip rag. Sorry, Global Times, I think China Daily is my new favorite Chinese state-run media. 2 major Apple shareholders pushed for a proposal that would force Apple to disclose censorship requests from China and any other country. The motion, set to be voted on by the company's investors this week, was prompted by numerous allegations of Apple kowtowing to Beijing and blocking apps from being used by Chinese customers. That includes Apple removing VPNs at Beijing's request. so that Chinese people can't access the outside internet on their iPhones. But good news for Apple. The votes are in and Apple will not be held accountable. Apple's major shareholders are all large corporations which themselves mostly have investments in China. So really, this helps everyone not be held accountable. But there is at least some good news this week. On February 19th, you saw our episode about how the Chinese consulate in New York put up an exhibit about Tibet in the Queen's Public Library, full of all sorts of propaganda. Well, this week, thanks to unrelenting pressure from local Tibetans and possibly China Uncensored pestering library officials for comment, the library took the exhibit down. Tibetans can finally celebrate a victory against the Chinese Communist Party. The Tibetans in exile, at least. But some not-so-great news coming up after the break. The World Health Organization is a lot more corrupt than you might think. And that corruption and tight relationship with Chinese leaders helped spread the coronavirus. This is China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. When the world is threatened by an outbreak of a deadly coronavirus from China, who are you gonna call? No. Who? The World Health Organization. I can see how that could be confusing. Let's just stick with WHO. And I can see how the WHO's response to the coronavirus could also be confusing, because it's hard to understand how the main global organization charged with handling it could have screwed up so badly. The World Health Organization is a United Nations body concerned with world health, at least supposedly. But it turns out corruption in the agency is putting lives at risk. By now, it's a recognized fact that the Chinese Communist Party has used a two-step solution to deal with the coronavirus. Step one, cover it up. They arrested whistleblowing doctors and journalists. And state-run media either kept numbers of infections impossibly low or didn't report on it at all. But after weeks of cover-up allowed the virus to spread across China and around the world, it became too big to cover up. So then, step two, authoritarian crackdown. The Chinese regime has quarantined much of Hubei province where the outbreak began. It is the largest quarantine in human history, with tens of millions of people affected. And now, much of the rest of the country is under lockdown as well. Now you might be thinking a quarantine makes sense, right? Except on this ginormous scale, it doesn't actually work well. It's been authoritarian, heavy-handed, and often arbitrary, varying from one village or city to another. And this has made Chinese people lose trust in their government. Some people look for ways to escape the quarantine zones, and many don't report to authorities when they get sick because the consequences could include being put in a quarantine center next to hundreds of other sick people. In some cases, people have said that the quarantine centers don't have enough medical staff or even food. According to an expert at the University of Edinburgh, the way Chinese authorities have gone about it is quite dangerous because you actually start to erode that trust in the government. You want citizens coming forward and saying, "I feel unwell." The Chinese Communist Party is getting slammed with international criticism for how they handled the coronavirus. But guess who hasn't been criticizing them? The World Health Organization. In fact, the WHO has been praising how the Communist Party has handled it. This is the Director General of the WHO, Tedros Adhanom, meeting with Chinese leader Xi Jinping 3 weeks ago. At the time, Tedros said, "We appreciate the seriousness with which China is taking this outbreak, especially the commitment from top leadership and the transparency they have demonstrated." He also said, China is actually setting a new standard for outbreak response. Detaining activists who criticize Xi Jinping? Technically, that is a new standard for outbreak response. Anyway, Tedros lavished praise on China, despite the fact that it took nearly 2 weeks for the agency to get a go-ahead from China to send even an advance team, which arrived in Beijing on February 10th to discuss a joint mission. Tedros' praise of China has been so lavish, he's been featured repeatedly in Chinese state-run media, like this video from the People's Daily.
China took action massively at the epicenter, at the source of the outbreak. This is heroic. The actions of China is making us safer.
Maybe it's just me, but I don't feel a whole lot safer. And keep in mind, Tedros was praising China's authoritarian response to the virus. At the same time, he was criticizing other countries, especially the US, for travel bans to and from China.
There is no reason for measures that unnecessarily interfere with international travel and trade. We call on all countries to implement decisions that are evidence-based and consistent.
Good thing no one listened to him. Major world airports set up screening procedures for travelers who had recently been to China. Many airlines simply stopped flights to and from China. You know, it's not a great thing when people ignore the main global organization that's meant to advise everyone on health crises. Tedros also said in an interview that the quarantine of tens of millions of Chinese people is consistent with the WHO's regulations that call for the least intrusive measures possible and strong protection for freedom of movement and other human rights. Least intrusive? I would hate to see what the WHO actually considers intrusive. Incidentally, Tedros was a leader in Ethiopia's Tigray People's Liberation Front. That's a wing of the ruling Marxist-rooted Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. He served the violently repressive regime as Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2012 to 2016 after a stint as Health Minister. So I would really hate to see what Tedros considers intrusive. Though he did say, "I think that human rights and so on should be respected." Yeah, human rights and so on, yada yada yada. But Tedros isn't the only one in the WHO who's praising the Chinese Communist Party's response to the coronavirus. Another WHO representative recently told a panel, "The people of China feel protected. We all need to take a step back and admire what's happened." Remember Peter Humphrey, the British private investigator who was jailed in China in 2013? He had been drugged, chained to a chair, locked in a cage, and then made to read out a statement written by the police in front of the cameras. The anchor who presented the footage, James Chow, is now a goodwill ambassador with the World Health Organization. This kind of praise for China has been going on for years. This statement from former WHO Director General Margaret Chan says, in the eyes of the world, China is increasingly seen as a model for development at many levels. China has lifted millions of its people out of poverty. And China is extremely fortunate to have a president who has made health the center of all government policies. And if the people don't want to be healthy, sometimes you just gotta force them. Incidentally, Beijing backed the appointment of Margaret Chan, a former director of health in Hong Kong, as WHO Director General from 2006 to 2017. But beyond just praise, the Chinese regime seems incredibly successful at getting the WHO to bow down to its claims over Taiwan. In case you don't know, Taiwan is a sovereign country with its own government, military, and currency. But the Chinese regime considers it part of China. And China has used its influence in the WHO to keep Taiwan out. Here's a speech given at a WHO meeting last year.
There is simply no principled basis why Taiwan should not be here. The only reason why it is not here now is because of the fact that the government in Beijing does not like the current administration in Taipei.
And yet, Taiwan is not allowed to join the World Health Organization as a member state, or even as an observer. And that puts Taiwan's population of 23 million people at risk. Taiwan's exclusion from the WHO leaves its population vulnerable during this crisis. A lack of direct and timely channels to the WHO have already resulted in inaccurate reporting of cases in Taiwan. Taiwan has repeatedly complained that China and the WHO aren't sharing information about the coronavirus outbreak with them. That's also what happened back in 2003 when the deadly SARS epidemic broke out in China. Besides putting 23 million Taiwanese lives at risk, that also affects the 50 million foreign travelers who pass through Taiwan's airports every year. They might assume the WHO is taking care of things. They would be wrong. In fact, the WHO can't even figure out what to call Taiwan. Last month, a WHO spokesman called it China Taiwan. And then a February 4th report flipped it and listed Taiwan China, but got the number of cases wrong, relying on data from Beijing, not Taipei. Now, the WHO doesn't even mention Taiwan. They recently called it Taipei and environs in a list of affected cities in China. Why does China have this kind of influence over the World Health Organization? It turns out the WHO is horribly corrupt. An audit revealed there has been a surge in internal corruption allegations across the whole of the organization, with the detection of multiple schemes aimed at defrauding large sums of money from the international body. That included an upsurge of internal complaints of corruption, fraud, and even sexual harassment from across the 7,000-strong organization, overwhelming an internal team of 4 full-time investigators and 2 consultants. And yet, the division of the WHO responsible for handling the coronavirus outbreak is so chronically underfunded it has repeatedly been found to pose a severe and unacceptable level of hazard. Great! So some people in the WHO are scamming loads of money and getting rich, while the coronavirus team is way underfunded. Maybe that's why the WHO delayed issuing a global emergency over the coronavirus, even though human-to-human transmission had already been confirmed. Or maybe it's because of China's role as a donor to the WHO. After this 2017 meeting between Tedros and high-level Chinese leaders, the WHO got a big new financial contribution from China. China also wants to build an $80 million headquarters for the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Guess where they want to build it? In Ethiopia. Wow, what a coincidence that that's Tedros' home country. The US is pretty sure it'll be used for spying. But China's importance to the WHO derives not so much as a current donor, but as a future source of funds and a partner with which to tackle the biggest global health problems. Well, China's got the money and 20% of the world's population. But is the ruling Communist Party really a good partner with which to tackle the biggest global health problems? A lot of health experts are furious at the WHO for their praise of China's response to the coronavirus and their delay in issuing a global emergency. According to Lawrence Gostin, a professor of global health law at Georgetown University, who also provides technical assistance to the WHO, we were deceived. Myself and other public health experts, based on what the World Health Organization and China were saying, reassured the public that this was not serious, that we could bring this under control. Allegations of corruption in the WHO are nothing new. In 2017, this expose from the Associated Press found that nearly half of the WHO's $2 billion budget went to first-class airfare and 5-star hotels. The United States is the largest contributor. U.S. taxpayers fund about a quarter of the WHO's budget. And get this, that doesn't include costs covered by host countries seeking to curry favor, which are off WHO's books. And if you know anything about the Chinese Communist Party and how they buy influence, it's often by spending on lavish trips. Now, there's no evidence that's what happened with the WHO. I'm just a bit concerned, what with all the corruption and bootlicking, especially because the WHO relies on the funding and the cooperation of members to function, giving wealthy member states like China considerable influence. So I know right now you're probably pretty worried about getting accurate information about the coronavirus outbreak. So here's my suggestion. Don't trust what the WHO says, and don't trust what Chinese leaders say. Watch what the leaders of countries actually do. When you see Chinese leaders wearing masks and canceling big national events, that's a sign you should still be cautious. Thanks for watching China Uncensored. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.
Viewers have described China Uncensored like The Daily Show, but about China.
In China, something can be illegal, but still in common practice. For example, bribery, or intellectual property theft, or Uber. But you know, there's a common Chinese saying, "La schmaz." What's that, Shelley? Oh, okay. I'm being told no Chinese people ever say that. At the beginning, I was super excited when I got 500 views on an episode, and now the show's grown to about 500,000 subscribers on YouTube. One episode reached 7.9 million people and counting. Ride in luxury to your destination in only double the amount of time it would take you to fly there. Dreams come true. And China is the little engine that could. I'm a little freaked out that many people have seen my face.
It's kind of ironic that I'm the minority in a show about China. People in the comments, they'll be like, "You're a traitor." I'm being a patriot. This is my way of showing that I love the country that I came from. Matt, Shelley, and I went to the Philippines to disputed waters, the Scarborough Shoal.
China and the Philippines claim the Scarborough Shoal. The Chinese military is asserting its claims in the South China Sea, so there's a dispute.
We had to take a rickety little Filipino fishing boat surrounded by threatening Chinese Coast Guard vessels.
Chris planted the China Uncensored flag, and then we got away with it. Chris, Shelley, our cameraman, and I went to the Waldorf Astoria in New York, hoping to interview the leader of China, Xi Jinping.
Oh, we are being helped. Going to...
What is it, China Uncensored?
China Uncensored, yeah. I don't suppose there's a chance I could use them.
Down the staircase.
The lead security guard followed us out and said we were banned for life from the Waldorf Astoria. Chris Chappell here right outside of Mongkok. Our camera guy is in there right now. He's seen people getting beat by police. Police are trying to tear down the tents. Things are wild now.
People would say things to us like, "My professor plays China Uncensored for our class." To see people really believe in what we were talking about was life-changing for all of us.
One word you would use to describe Chris Chappell.
Committed.
Hilarious.
Engaging. Intriguing.
Have you heard of China Uncensored? Great comedy show. Hey, have you heard of China Uncensored? It's starring me.
It's more and more obvious that China is having a major influence on the U.S.
The way that the US is treating China now, it will start to affect people's lives, and they'll need somewhere to go to learn about that.
Hey, have you heard of China Uncensored? 中国解密. In 5 years, I see China Uncensored as the only show available on TV or the internet. It will be the sole source of edutainment worldwide. Have you heard of China Uncensored?
I have.
You actually have? He's heard of China Uncensored.
I love China Uncensored.